Hello, everyone. So this is No One Warned You podcast, and this is the second episode of a series of three. We're having James Agris here, and remember, this is the podcast where we have no fluff conversations, so that you know the things you should know when you're starting a business or growing your business. And in the first episode, we talked about how to actually uh, guess how to value your business and add value and when you're doing investments and sponsorships, how you do that. And now we're going to talk about you're building on sand and don't know it. So, James, to start this conversation here, when we were talking and getting ready for this podcast, you said that every deal comes down to four questions. And uh, share with us what are those four questions and why those four?
Yeah. So I would say every deal comes out to more than four questions, but the commercial due diligence work, which is what I do, typically rests on kind of four key questions, right? The first question is market dynamics. How large is the market size for a particular good or service? How fast is it growing? What's driving the growth? What could potentially prevent the growth? So that's kind of question one. Question two is customer dynamics, customer purchasing dynamics. Who are the key customers for this good or service? How do they make their purchasing decisions? How easy is it for them to churn? So those are kind of the next set of questions that I often answer. Third set of questions has to do with competitive market dynamics. So who are the key competitors or alternatives for a particular product or service? How do the competitors differentiate from one another? And how is the target company positioned in a competitive environment in which they operate? And the fourth question is really synthesis, right? So given all of this, what does this mean kind of post-acquisition for the acquirer? What can they do in order to maximize the value of the company, or what are the red flags that could potentially result in repricing of a deal, prior to its finalization.
Okay, so those are the things that in your work, those are the things you're mostly looking into.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would also say that not every deal is the same, right? And for some deals, some of the questions become more important than others, right? So just to give you an
Okay.
example, right? I was looking at a company that provided it's kind of a time tracking software slash hardware solution for rural hospitals. And the key question for that is, well, okay, how big is actually the market for something like this, right? Um, but if you're looking at, let's say, an HVAC service provider in Philadelphia, right, in the greater Philadelphia area, well, it's really the market size isn't really that important because it's one company out of 100, right, that provides HVAC servicing in Philadelphia area, and really the question is about kind of execution, right? So um, you know, how customers make their purchasing decisions is also really probably similar, right, across all companies. And it really is about competitive differentiation and execution. And so those questions become more important during diligence. So I think like I said, every diligence is unique because every deal is unique.
I like it. Every due diligence is unique because every deal is unique. So there is no copy and paste.
No, as much as a lot of the AI tools that have populated the market over the past 2 years claim that you can just kind of point a solution towards the deal room, the data room, or the market or something, or produce a diligence report based on a template. I do not see that as a feasible alternative to what I do.
I see. And I agree. And James, how do you actually size a market? And where do you see that founders fool themselves most?
Yeah, so I mean, this it's a large topic, and actually a couple of years ago, I recorded a long podcast, was probably an hour-long podcast on this topic alone. But fundamentally, right, there's kind of three ways to do it, right? One is kind of top down, right? So we can look in terms of, um, you have a large, you know, kind of larger market, right? And you are a subsegment of the market. So, you have, let's say, fast fashion retail, right? And then you have, fast fashion retail um, in a particular geography, right? Targeting a particular demographic at a particular price point, right? So you can kind of whittle down these larger markets into a smaller one, right? And say, okay, this is kind of what the market is here. There is a bottom up, right, trajectory. So you basically could say, okay, for this good a service, there's so many customers that exist here, right? And X% of potential customers purchase this particular good or service in a given year, right? And an average price is Y dollars, right? So one times X times Y times Z equals $100 million, right? And that's fundamentally kind of how you size it, right? I think this is probably when people think about market sizing, this is kind of how they think about it, right? And I actually have built a tool that kind of helps size very um, specific local markets for service-based businesses. Think HVAC, like I mentioned earlier, or veterinary services. It's a tool called Pinpoint IQ that you can kind of look up, and it essentially allows people to do just that based on a kind of a model that I defined and a number of different parameters. But fundamentally, that's what it is, right? You kind of look at these different incidence rates and number of customers and kind of multiply it out. It's a big complex model essentially. And the third most common way is what they call competitive build, right? So that there is 8 large competitors in this market, and they probably have 90% share of the market. The competitor X is $100 million, competitor Y is $50 million, and so on. You add them together, and you end up with a market size. Ideally, you're probably doing all 3 of these for due diligence, and you're trying to triangulate based on all 3 data points, and hopefully they come in somewhat close. That you can then say, okay, this is what the market looks like. And then on top of that, like more important is not necessarily even the size of the market, but like the different segments, right? So if you're serving a particular niche or particular segment of the larger market, you kind of want to understand, okay, the segment can be geographic, the segment can be a particular type of customer, it can be a particular sub-service. I was doing, let's say, behavioral health software at one point. Well, this behavioral health software focused specifically on substance use disorder, right? So it's kind of a segment that they're trying to size, right? Because you probably have, as a company, more differentiation targeting this particular segment than a broader market as a whole. And then another thing that becomes very important is not necessarily in the market size, but the market growth, right? So, how fast is the market growing? So you can look in terms of growth in terms of the customer base, right? So more and more customers are coming into the space. You can look in terms of market growth in terms of adoption, right? More and more customers are adopting this particular type of product or service, or price growth, right? And there's a number of other factors you can kind of incorporate. So ideally, you want to see it all, right? In a true due diligence, right? You want to understand the size of the market using different methodologies, and you want to understand how fast it's growing. And as a seller, right, if you kind of take a seller lens here, right, this is where you want to present to the potential buyer, right? A lot of times I see, seller materials, confidential information memorandum that just basically kind of pull up a report from IBIS or Grand View Research and say market is $25 billion and it's growing at 9% X, and how those numbers would derive, nobody really knows, but they just want to put something for the sellers, right? I think doing a more thoughtful exercise in terms of the market is not only helpful in terms of selling the company, but also understanding your own kind of white space opportunity as a business, right? To really truly understand, okay, what's really addressable to you, what's serviceable to you, right? And what you can actually obtain. Right? There's different definitions of market size. Anyway, I can go on this topic for hours, like I said, but yeah, hopefully this kind of answers this question to begin with.
No, it does. It does. And it got me thinking here. What would you say? What would you say, James? It gives more value to a company. Would you say it's a very niched business? So they they sell for a smaller market, but no one is doing it. Or would you say it's better to target a larger audience, but then having more
Yeah.
competition like the HVAC, and probably there isn't a black and white answer or just how to draw a line in the sand, but how do you see that?
Yeah. I don't think really there's a single answer to this question, right? Like you said, some markets are fundamental. Markets fundamentally are very different, right? I think what's important to understand, right? There's really three kind of address or market size definitions, right? There's something we call the TAM, total addressable market. It means overall kind of market that you can potentially reach with your product and service, right? So let's say, just to use an example of, dental practice management software, right? So it's a giant, $25 billion kind of market, right? So that's your total addressable market. Then there's a question of serviceable addressable market. So that means with your specific good or service, how big is the slice of the market that you can potentially reach? So let's say you have software that targets orthodontists only, right? Specific features. So that becomes a much smaller segment of the market. Maybe that's $500 million, right? And then there's a third market definition, which is called serviceable, obtainable market, right? So given the competitive dynamics, what's the kind of the potential market share that you can even reach here, right? So maybe in that $500 million market slice, there is, 8 competitors and 4 of them are really established and they kind of own, $400 million of that market, right? So now you can only reach $100 million, right? Or obtain rather $100 million realistically, right? And then the kind of, feasible time frame, right? So I think understanding of all those segments is important for a business, and then telling a story around it, right? So, maybe today you're only able to obtain that slice, but you can build the market and increase your obtainable market and reach a higher share of the serviceable addressable market. And maybe through acquisition or building adjacent capabilities, you can increase your serviceable addressable market, your SAM, and reach a higher portion of the TAM. I think that's the story that probably resonates most with a potential investor.
That's pretty good. And I'm thinking here, James, if I'm going to reverse engineer what you do, and 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 let's say with something that Pinpoint IQ does, let's say inside a certain market, if I'm starting a business, how do I practically use that information to actually be able to use that? And I don't know if you project some kind of revenue or how to use that in a practical sense to improve your business or just to start well.
Yeah. Well, so I think as we talked in the last episode, as you're starting a business, that's probably not a key question you want to answer, right? You really want to understand, is there customer demand for what I'm doing, right? Am I doing something distinct or different that can result in sales, right? But I think as you get going, right, and you're trying to grow the business, then the question of, okay, what is the actual white space available to me here, right? That's the question of market size more than anything. Um, if you kind of do this analysis and, after you've been in business and you can understand what your core competency is and the type of customers that you're most successful with or able to serve, and you do that analysis and you realize that, okay, my business is $25 million in revenue, but the total addressable market is 50. And, and this is where I'll kind of tap out. Well, then this presents a very clear limit on the growth of your business with its current business model. And you have to think about, okay, what do I need to do in order to increase my TAM or to increase my SAM? So really, it's more a question for, acquisition and certainly for growth strategy for any existing business.
Okay. Yeah. I'm thinking here also from out of analysis and works you've done. What are some mirages you have seen, meaning things that apparently looked huge and with potential, but eventually they were just an illusion or didn't make sense?
Kind of hard for me to come up with an example from the top of my head. But yeah, here's I think a good example, right? So I was looking at a company that provides ready mix concrete, right, for construction services, right? So you see the cement trucks on a road, right? This is essentially what they do. So you look in terms of the total addressable kind of market for ready-mix concrete. I don't have the number at the top of my head, but it's huge, right? Because concrete is it's a uh, it's cement is like the second most produced substrate that kind of in the world, right? So it's a multi-billion-dollar market. Okay, so you see a seller, right, and they kind of put that in the sim, and even in the location where they work, right, is a giant kind of construction market. So they put these giant numbers, but then once you start kind of fiddle it down, right? Well, you're only able to pour concrete a certain distance from the plant, uh, and the decision making on concrete isn't necessarily differentiated between different competitors. Really, is whoever's closest, and I mean the price is the price. Most of the time, it's kind of set, right? So it's really about service, but service is actually, if you're in business doing this type of work in any kind of established market, your service is probably fine, right? So it's really hard to kind of gain share. It's really hard to lose share unless you really screw something up. So then, the acquisition costs are fairly high and established, right? You're not really gaining anything because it's such a established market, right? So then when you kind of fiddle it down, right, really it's a couple plants and the customers that they have within the service area, right? And they're doing really well because they're doing some road construction in that kind of immediate geographic vicinity. But the funding, for road construction is going to run out in 3 years, and they'll be kind of, in a much worse place down the line, right? So I think that's kind of like a good example of where the TAM seems giant, right? But the SAM is a lot smaller, and the SAM is minuscule and probably not growing, right?
That's such a good example, James. Such a good example, and just a good reminder of that. Not everything that looks as it is, it actually is, right?
Absolutely.
James, thank you so much. I enjoyed very much this conversation. And if you watch this episode, this is the second episode of a series of three videos with James. If you haven't watched the first one, go back. And then now we're moving into our third episode where we're going to talk about AI and how it can lead you to or mislead you into your decisions in your business. Thank you very much. Thank you, James.
You're very welcome. Bye bye.